This is part 2 of the lectures on chapter 6. Let me go ahead and put the slideshow back up. We are on section 6.2. Now we're going to be talking about bone. 6.1 was about cartilage. So we know the skeleton is primarily composed of bones. The functions of bones are to support the body and soft organs, protection. For example, the skull protects the brain. The spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae. The heart and lungs are protected by the rib cage. For movement, the bones are levers for muscle action. And then for mineral and growth factor storage, so calcium and phosphorus would be the minerals, and growth factor, it's like a growth factor reservoir. Is also nutrient storage too, and the bones. Oh, I bet it's on the next page. Okay, blood cell formation is what I was going to say, and for nutrient storage, the bones produce or store fat. So that's one place that fat is actually stored, is in bone cavities. Bone also forms blood cells, and that means red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are formed in the red marrow cavities of certain bones. Blood cell formation is called hematopoiesis. And this is literally every type of blood cell, even though platelets are fragments of blood cells, but the three types would be the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And then the bones store fat in the form of triglycerides, and the bones produce a hormone called osteocalcin, and this helps to regulate insulin secretion, glucose levels, and metabolism. Now, this is one you may not have ever heard of. This is new information. And, there's always new information in anatomy and biology in general, but hormone production has never been on the functions before when I've taught this course. So this is new information for me anyway. Okay, now we classify the bones based on if they're in the axial skeleton or the appendicular skeleton. There are 206 bones in the human skeleton that we have names for. The axial skeleton is going to include the skull, the vertebral column or the spine, and the rib cage. So everything in the very middle section, median section of our body. The skull, the vertebrae, and the rib cage. That's it for axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is going to have 3 parts. It will have the upper limbs, which is the arms, the lower limbs, which is the legs. Then it will have the pectoral and pelvic girdles. Pectoral and pelvic girdles. And we'll have that in the notes in just a minute. So there's 4 sections within the appendicular skeleton, 3 sections within the axial. We have already seen this, the bones and cartilages of the human skeleton. We've already looked at this. Okay, and then section 6.3, the way that we classify bones based on their shape is they are either long bones, that means they're longer than they are wide, and your limb bones, your arm and leg bones, are good examples of long bones. Short bones are cube-shaped bones, fairly cube-shaped, and they're your wrist bones or carpals and your ankle bones or tarsals. And then sesamoid bones form within tendons. The patella of the knee is a great example of a sesamoid bone because it is formed within the quadriceps tendon. Then there are flat bones, the sternum or breastbone, breastplate, scapula or shoulder blades, the ribs, and most skull bones are flat bones. Even though the skull bones are rounded, they're in their thickness, they're flat. They're very, very thin bones. Then there are irregular bones. The vertebrae and the hip bones are definitely irregular in shape. One that is hard sometimes to remember is the clavicle, because the clavicle is kind of curvy. This is the clavicle, oh gosh, I can't think, collarbone. Okay, so the clavicle is kind of curvy, but it is classified as a long bone, not an irregular shaped bone. Okay. And here's some pictures. The humerus or the upper arm bone is a long bone. An irregular bone, here's a picture of an example vertebra. And looks like it's taken from the lumbar region of the spine. And then this is the sternum, which is an example of a flat bone. This is the breastplate between that your ribs are attached to, some of them anyway. And then the talus is a bone in the ankle. It's one of the tarsals. It's kind of cubic shaped. I mean, it's not going to be a perfectly shaped cube, but it's short. You can see, it's a cubic shaped in comparison to long bones. Okay, so we call bones organs because they do contain different types of tissues, and an organ is many tissues that work together, that function together as one. So bones are organs. The tissue in bone is called osseous tissue. Bone tissue is called osseous tissue. But bone also has nervous tissue, cartilage, fibrous connective tissue, muscle cells, epithelial cells, in the form of the epithelial cells are found in the blood vessels. So nervous tissue, cartilage, fibrous connective tissue, muscle cells, and the epithelial cells that are found in the blood vessels. Mainly the blood vessels are small capillaries. 3 levels of structure: gross, microscopic, and chemical, and that's in any topic of anatomy. It's going to be the macroscopic or gross, and then the microscopic level and the chemical level. You are really mainly responsible for learning this part, the anatomy of the gross anatomy, or the like the names of the bones. You're mainly and the parts of the bones. You're mainly responsible for that, but I will go into a little more detail with the microscopic and the chemical information, that which chapter 6 contains a lot of that information. Spongy bone can be compact, or it can be, I'm sorry, bone can be compact or spongy. Compact bone has some spongy bone lining it on the inside, but it's got a very dense, thick outer layer. It's just heavier. It doesn't have as many air spaces. And then spongy bone. And by the way, compact bone is made up of units of bone called osteons. Osteons. I'm sure we'll see this in just a minute, but this is how these are the words that help me remember them. Compact bone is composed of osteons, and spongy bone is composed of trabeculae. We'll see a picture of those, but the main thing is that there are open spaces in spongy bone, and those spaces can be filled with red or yellow bone marrow. Here is an example of spongy bone in the epiphysis of the femur. This is your thigh bone. This is showing you the head of the femur and the neck. And the greater trochanter, as we'll review when we get a chance. The femur is the only bone. This area here is the trochanter. The femur is the only bone that has trochanters, which are large projections off of the bone. But anyway, you see spongy bone in the ends of the bone, and then you see compact bone more in the diaphysis. We find compact bone in the diaphysis of long bones, not because long bones are the only ones with a diaphysis. As far as structure of short, irregular, flat bones, they are mostly spongy bone, covered by a thin layer of compact bone. The compact bone that covers the spongy bone is sandwiched between connective tissue membranes. The outside membrane is the periosteum, and the inside membrane is the endosteum. Bone marrow is scattered throughout spongy bone in the spaces between the trabeculae. There is no marrow cavity in spongy bone. And at the ends of joints, hyaline cartilage, which if it's found at the ends of bones at a joint is called articular cartilage. But hyaline cartilage covers bone covers the ends of bones that meet in a joint, like the knee joint or the shoulder joint. We talked about that before. What we're looking at here is a flat bone of the skull. Looks like part of the parietal bone, and you're just taking that little tiny piece from here, and you see that it's lined with compact bone. It's a very thick spongy bone layer, and then more compact bone on the top. And then a microscopic view of the trabeculae of spongy bone, the air spaces. And the trabeculae is the bone parts, and the air spaces are air spaces. With a typical long bone, you're going to have the shaft or the middle of the bone. The long part is the diaphysis, and the ends of the bone are called epiphyses. Each end is called an epiphysis, but both together they're called epiphyses. And then there will be membranes. So the diaphysis is the shaft, and it consists mainly of compact bone, and it contains a marrow cavity or medullary cavity that is filled with yellow marrow. So ask yourself, what is stored? What is the function of the medullary cavity of long bones? Is it going to be to produce blood cells or store fat? And the answer is in the color. It's yellow marrow, so the main purpose is to store fat. People who like to eat wild, like wild elk and wild game, I guess you could say. One of the things that I've watched these shows because my husband does, but I've seen on the hunting shows when they cook right after they skin the deer or the elk or whatever, they say the bone marrow is wonderful, and I watch them fry it on a pan over a flame, and but it's mostly fat. It's what they're actually doing is frying up little chunks of fat. Anyway, I don't guess this is a food show, a food class, but thought I would throw that in. The epiphyses, the ends of the long bones, have layers of compact bone, but mostly they're composed of spongy bone. There is articular cartilage covering the ends of the epiphyses, and that is the hyaline cartilage. And then between the diaphysis and epiphysis is the epiphyseal line, but when you're still growing, it is the epiphyseal plate, and it is made of hyaline cartilage.